There we go. Well, hello, everyone.
Hello.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you don't know where you are, this is Left Bank Books Presents Ann Hood. And tonight she will discuss her entertaining and fascinating memoir of her adventurous years as a TWA flight attendant. And we are here to celebrate the paperback release, which is today.
Yay!
Before we start, I would like to welcome the virtual audience. Hello, everyone joining us
virtual
virtually.
audience.
This is part of what we do to make our events more accessible. So if you are ever in desperate desire to attend an event, but you know that you have to be somewhere else, just know that our events, most of the events that we produce, happen both in person and also into the hybrid world. So you can catch all of our previous events on our YouTube page, and you can check out our event calendar for really exciting events like the one we have next week with Curtis Settenfeld.
Yeah.
Really excited about that. Today, it was announced that she is one of 2 authors that have ever been selected for Reese Witherspoon's book club twice.
Whoa.
Yes, so we are hosting her for her new book, Romantic Comedy, and that will be next Tuesday for a ticketed event. So if you want to watch that one virtually, you do have to buy a virtual ticket. But we are really excited to welcome Curtis back to St. Louis. And we have a ton, like literally a ton of events in April. I think we, if you spread them out, over 1 per day. So I'm certain that there is an event for you in that calendar. So be sure to check it out and find other fantastic presentations that we will be having. But now about tonight's book. Dennis Lehane, the New York Times bestselling author, says, Fly Girl is a sheer pleasure, a hilarious and often moving look back at a bygone era and a young woman's coming of age. And we are hosting Dennis Lehane for a virtual event.
Cool.
And he's going to be in conversation with Gillian Flynn.
Whoa, nice.
Exciting.
Tell him hi.
I won't be talking to them. They don't let me talk to them.
Okay.
Yeah. They're like, no, you don't get to talk to Dennis. No, you will freak out too much. So, the 2 other authors that we've hosted, actually 3 other authors that we've hosted that I have on this list speak so highly about this book, but I will read one from Christina Baker Klein as well. In this warm and engaging memoir, Ann Hood captures the heady thrills as well as the grueling realities of life as a flight attendant during the golden age of air travel. Over 8 years, Hood walked 1,000,000 miles, explored far-flung cities, and learned invaluable lessons that shaped her as a writer and as a person. A brisk history lesson, an affectionate homage, and a thoughtful critique of the airline industry. Fly Girl soars. Ann Hood is the author of 11 books, including the best-selling novels The Book That Matters Most and The Knitting Circle, and the memoirs Comfort, A Journey Through Grief, and Kitchen Yarns, Notes on Life, Love, and Food. She lives in Providence, Rhode Island, and New York City, and is here with us this evening. So if you would please help me in warmly welcoming the incredible Ann Hood.
Thank you, Shane. That's so nice. Thank you. So I've been practicing this all day. I don't get nervous at readings because I'm just talking about my book and I know about my book. But I'm here to make a public apology to the city of St. Louis. Because if you've read the book, you know that I did not like living here. And I'm so sorry because it's such a great place. In later years when I would return, I saw all the things I didn't see as kind of a crabby 24-year-old who felt kind of yanked from this great glamorous life in Boston. No, I don't like Boston, so we don't want to talk about that today. But that was my first place I moved out of college, working for TWA, 6 flight attendants in this 6th floor apartment overlooking Boston Harbor. It faced Logan Airport. We could see each other come and go. Actually, it's like, oh, she's on that flight. And in one day, they said, you're being transferred to St. Louis. And I'm like, to where? And I had to get a car. We had to give over our apartment. I had to leave the guy I just fallen in love with, And we drove to St. Louis. We didn't know where to begin. I mean, sometimes I think, and I'm sure many of you do too, what did we do before Google and ways to look up neighborhoods? And so we grabbed this place in an hour. This couple was moving, a flight attendant couple, was moving from St. Louis they'd been transferred to JFK, and they had this townhouse in Florissant, which I'm sure is a lovely place. But it was in the middle of nowhere, there was nothing around, and we moved in, 4 of us, and we're just sitting and we're like, what's happened to us? Wait a minute, we were walking here and doing this, that. And one of my roommates, a flight attendant like I was, but she had been a Playboy bunny. And she just had a way of finding stuff out. She would go out and come back with so much information. And what she came back with that saved our lives, she said, there is a place called the Central West End. And that's where we need to go every night till this lease is up. And there was a restaurant called Culpeppers. Restaurant bar, we used to go there all the time. I was gonna go tonight, I feel like it closed. I was like devastated. I emailed my roommates, I'm still friends with them. I'm like, Culpeppers is gone, But anyway, so I owe a huge apology because in the book I do talk about what culture shock I was in, and how, when you wanna be a flight attendant, for some people, and definitely for me, I wanted to leave my small town and I wanted to see the world. And that apartment in Boston, and then later I lived in New York, was more what I envisioned from movies like Boeing. I mean, ridiculous models. And I wanted to fly international, and I know that while I was here, St. Louis started flying international on TWA. We had Paris routes and London routes, but when I first moved, it meant you were going to Pittsburgh a lot. And so just a lot of things were not working for my young self. But since I've been back, and discovered barbecue here, which is like one of the greatest things ever, amongst other things, fried ravioli, I'm going for it tomorrow. Now I know what I missed because I was so sulky and just a young person. So I'm gonna read a little, talk a little, open it up for questions. A lot of people have asked me why I wrote this book so many years after I did this job. That's a great question. When I say I'm somewhere and people say, what do you do, like at a cocktail party or whatever, and I say I'm a writer, like their eyes kind of glaze over. They're like, oh, have I read anything you've written? I don't know, what have you read? I don't know. But if it comes out that I had been a flight attendant, all of a sudden I have an audience. Everybody has questions. They want to know about it. They really are curious, especially because I flew in what was the tail end of what they call the golden age of flying. When passengers dressed up to fly, our uniforms were so snappy. Just as an example, in coach, going from Boston to Los Angeles, we handed out menus to our coach passengers, choice of 5 entrees. We came through and took their orders. We did with our cart, we did a cocktail service with, some kind of nuts, but not the little peanut bags, like warm nuts. We did an appetizer service. It was skewers of mozzarella and tomatoes. Then we gave them whatever their entree choice had been. Then we did a dessert service. Then we passed out mints, TWA mints. They had the TWA logo stamped on them. And they were like light green. I don't know, do you know melt-away mints? That's what they were, but they were kind of bigger. Then we did an after dinner drink service with like amaretto and Bailey's Irish Cream and like all those liqueurs. And we would take out that cardigan and we would put dry ice on it and flick water, and that made it kind of smoke. So we were like in a cloud as we walked down, and that was in coach. Never mind what was going on up in first class, where we were cooking Chateaubriand to order and wheeling it out and carving it seat side, making ice cream sundaes, working our butts off. So really everything in the airline industry was and still is determined by seniority. And when you were junior, like I was for most of my career, even after 8 years, I was still kind of at the bottom. You often got the hardest jobs, which meant often being in first class, but I kind of liked that because it was just so elegant. And never saw a woman in first class. It was always men, I'm ashamed to say, unless it was like Diana Ross or some famous woman, like Anwar Sadat's wife was on my flight once. But otherwise it was businessmen, so it was the times were so different. You closed that curtain. But unlike today, what was going on in most of the plane was still an incredible experience. And people who remember flying then still talk about it quite fondly. I've had so many emails from people who've read it, sharing their memories of being a kid on a flight like that, or being an adult like that. And those days, as we know, are gone. I mean, I flew in today from LaGuardia, and my flight was at 7:30, and I got upgraded because, I have a zillion miles, no other reason. And it was potato chips. At 7:30 in the morning, they handed me a bag of potato chips. And I was like, I was imagining an omelet. I don't know, I'm still delusional. This is years. Anyway, so I realized that people were interested in that time. But to me, I knew a lot of anecdotes, but I didn't really see a story. And because I'm a fiction writer predominantly, I always look at what's the story in this. It has to have an arc, the old-fashioned kind of writing a story. And I thought, you can't write a book that's just a bunch of anecdotes. And then one day, shortly before the pandemic, maybe 6 months before, kind of thing, I'm at a dinner or whatever, oh, you were a flight attendant, what was that like? And then someone made this observation that, wow, you flew during the golden age of flying, and you ended when things started going to hell, basically, started going. And I hadn't really thought about it historically. And that got me thinking, maybe there is a book in here somewhere. So I began to research and went out to see my roommate, lives in Santa Barbara, my old roommate, and went out and shared all our stories. And slowly I began to realize that there was even a bigger story for me, which is it's actually a coming of age story. I was 21 years old when I got hired. I was fresh out of college. I had traveled a little to very weird places like Brazil, the Bahamas, and Hawaii. I don't know what that was about, but so I had traveled a little, but I was pretty immature and unsophisticated. And I wanted this job because I imagined a different version of myself that I felt this job could give me. And I'm going to read a little bit about my first flight and stuff, so I don't want to say too much, but those dreams certainly came true. So as I was thinking about it and researching, I realized, wow, I do have a story here. It's a personal story about a kid from a small town in the smallest state. Does anybody know what the smallest state is?
Rhode Island.
Yes, Rhode Island. Some people say Delaware. I'm like, what? No, they're second small. From a tiny mill town in Rhode Island, who just always had stars in my eyes. And there were two things I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be a flight attendant. Now, when I wanted to be a flight attendant, they were so-called stewardesses. That changed in 1976 when men won the right in the Supreme Court to have the job. So they had to rename the job. It wasn't that long ago when you think about it. One thing that I want to say, I'm going to read some funny stories and talk about some funny things and answer anything when that part comes. But I want to say that, the job definitely, when I began, had a great deal of sexism. They were considered glorified waitresses. I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of the book Coffee, Tear of Me, but it's kind of a disgusting book that really objectifies women in general and flight attendants specifically. But from the time the job began in the 1920s, it was women fighting for women's rights. And so despite, it's such a contradiction, because despite having to look a certain way and the sexism inherent in the job, flight attendants, stewardesses, and then flight attendants were actually winning a lot for women's rights in the workplace. So the first flight attendant, Ellen Church, actually had her pilot's license. And she went to what would later become United Airlines and said she wanted to be a pilot, and they laughed. They said, no, women can't do that. She knew that aviation was the future. And so she's like, there's gotta be a way that I can get on that airplane. She was a registered nurse, and so she proposed the idea of having nurses on the flights because people were afraid to fly. It was very new. They were flying below 10,000 feet, so many people were sick because it was very bumpy. The engines were super loud. It wasn't a pleasant experience, just like now, for different reasons, but. So she convinced this guy, this executive, that there should be nurses. So she got 7 of her friends, and they're still called the first 8. And they were the first flight attendants. And until World War II, flight attendants, called stewardesses then, wore nurses' uniforms. You had to be a registered nurse. World War II came, and they needed them for the war. And that's when everything changed. Because a very smart executive at American Airlines said, wow, all these women are coming for this job. I'm gonna hire the pretty ones. More people will fly my airline. Not everyone did that, but they saw he was getting more. His business was better. And that changed the professionalism. So then it became more about looks and more about looks and sort of sex kitten a little bit perhaps. All sorts of things. I've met so many women who said their fathers wouldn't let them take the job because it was too sexy. I've met so many women who their fathers said that, so they became flight attendants at the age of 50 or 60 because they're like, I always wanted this job and I'm gonna do it now, you know? So we fought for, at the beginning, you had to retire when you were 32. TWA, who I worked for, said, if a man doesn't want her by the time she's 32, TWA doesn't either. So you have to leave at 32, we won that, that was age, right? Then you had to retire if you got married. That also went to the Supreme Court. Then you had to retire if you had a baby. They won that in 1986. Now, this is not that long ago, but this is after so many cases and going to the Supreme Court over and over, like flight attendants are relentless. The last right we won was to get rid of the weight requirement. That happened in 1993. Yeah, so, and this is a personal one for me because my roommate of the 6 when we lived in Boston was fired for being 5 pounds overweight. We would get off an airplane and you'd have surprise weigh-ins. And they'd take you down these stairs and there was a scale. And the supervisor had a clipboard. And if you were over your hiring weight, you had 3 chances to lose that weight. So my beautiful roommate Linda was sent packing because she was 5 pounds over her hiring weight. And I want to add that she was 5'9" and she weighed 130 pounds when she was fired. Yeah. So it's one of the interesting things about this is that it's a job of contradictions. And because I was hired in 1978, it was an era of contradictions in general. Women were winning rights, but also still had one foot in the past. I still had friends who were in college for their MRS, instead of any other degree. Yet many of my friends went off for the first time to work in the business sector. There was marketing became a big major. So I thought it was a very confusing time in general, and the job seemed to reflect that. What was interesting is once I decided that I had a story, the pandemic came, and I spent those years writing about this time when I traveled every day. So here I was, like washing my groceries, before I brought them in, and not even going to the store, but I would sit down every day and revisit this exciting time of my life. So it really was a savior for me to write the book when I did. So just a few little things. I always like to say this is from the prologue, but it tells you a lot about what my 8 years were like. I couldn't know that I would come of age at a remarkable time for aviation. Flying was still glamorous, and flight attendants were considered to be beautiful, sexy ornaments, even as they fought relentlessly for women's rights against age and gender discrimination and for career professionalism. I was hired as a flight attendant the same year deregulation began and changed how we flew forever. Over the next 8 years, I would experience the end of the golden age of flying, watch major airlines go bankrupt, endure layoffs and a labor strike, and walk over 1 million miles in high heels on flights, smiling as I served thousands of passengers. I worked in one of the most demanding, sexist, exciting, glorious jobs a person can have. I was a flight attendant. I have to say this weird thing, but my neighbor, she read Fly Girl, she told me she was reading it. And then I saw her in the elevator and I said, oh, I heard you left your job. Another neighbor had told me. She looked all embarrassed. Well, I read your book and, well, I just got hired by American Airlines to be a flight attendant. So I was like, if you don't like it, don't come looking for me. I was 21, you're like 40. So I always say that I was this person who, with stars in my eyes, and to me, being a flight attendant meant working for TWA or Pan Am, because they were the only airlines that were international back in 1978 when I applied. Eastern Airlines, and you will notice all 3 of these airlines have gone bankrupt. The only one that survived of the big 4 when I was applying is United. My father talked me into applying to Eastern by convincing me the Caribbean was, international. And he also had heard that United had won the China route out of San Francisco, and he thought that was great. He was right. That was going to start them on a path to be an international airline. So I only applied to those airlines that I thought would take me to glamorous places. Eastern Airlines, I got right up to the end and didn't get hired. I was devastated. Pan Am, I flunked the French test. I did great on the written test, but then the guy said, say in French, please put that bag under the seat in front of you. I was like, I don't see who plays in there, but that's really good. And they said, no, you're nervous, that's okay. Please say, fasten your seatbelts, we're hitting a turbulent area. And I was like, thank you for your time, but I am failing this test. But I did get hired by TWA and United, and I chose TWA because I was still convinced, they were the best airline. And three interviews, 2 in Boston, 1 in Kansas City, and that Kansas City interview was 3 days long. You stayed at the training academy, they watched you, they wrote down everything. They were pleasant, but you couldn't read, what was going on. And it was one of the most stressful things I have ever had to do, but I did get hired. And we had 6 weeks of training. There was a major airline crash and all these planes got grounded. So we had to end training at 4 weeks. And we weren't ready. Now training involved FAA training, which would get everybody off that plane. TWA had 7 kinds of aircraft, so you had to be able to evacuate 7 different airplanes, do all the emergency equipment, know where it was, they're all different. Then you had to do TWA's policies. Then there was the service thing, then there was the grooming stuff, and then there was just passenger relations, and just rules, right? Because it was a big company. So we're called into the auditorium and it's like, hey, everybody, no more training. Tomorrow you're going on your first flight. And some of us did not even have our uniforms yet. Like we were working in the uniform skirt and our own shirt, and it was crazy. And everybody got sent somewhere else. And I was sent to Boston to fly a Boston-LA flight. And it was terrifying. So I'm just gonna read what that first flight was like. The list of everything I didn't know on that first flight was long. I didn't know there were 2 cabins separated by a blue curtain. Oh no, I'm reading the wrong thing. Holy cow. That's my very first flight. Sorry about that. That was my first flight to Bermuda. I marked the wrong thing. Okay, here it is. Basically, I did everything wrong on that flight. I had imagined looking pretty, talking to passengers, effortlessly gliding down those beautiful twin aisles offering martinis. Instead, I could not open or set up the carts. I was forever running up and down because I kept forgetting things. I forgot that we served rolls altogether, and another flight attendant threw them cold into the basket, growling at me. I couldn't keep the names of the wines straight. I couldn't open a champagne bottle, and I could not remember where anything was stored. Worst of all, I didn't know that I should have 2 pairs of shoes, the required high heels to be worn whenever we had our blazers on, in the airport, during boarding, and during deplaning. And then a pair of flats for the rest of the flight, for the hours of standing and running up and down those aisles. That spare pair of flats got jammed into your regulation purse, but I had only high heels for 7 hours straight. By about hour 4, I was wincing with every step. My feet started to swell at hour 5, at which point I took off my high heels and worked the rest of the flight in my stocking feet, something I could have been fired for if anyone had noticed me. When we finally landed, a red-faced, angry flight attendant came marching up from coach to ask me what I'd been doing the whole flight. I said I worked first class. I was supposed to help and coach too, she reminded me. I forgot, I admitted, mumbling an apology, trying to move my numb feet, which were now squeezed back into my high heels per our dress code. The crew went off to the employee parking lot because they were all based in LA. I limped through LAX trying to look like the polished person who belonged in her Ralph Lauren uniform. I retrieved the list of which hotel we stayed in at each city that was carefully folded up in my pocket. Almost in tears, I made my way outside and searched for the shuttle to the hotel. Finally, the van arrived. I got to the hotel, checked in, hobbled to my room, and took off my shoes and my pantyhose. My uniform stank of smoke. My hair stank of smoke. I have to interrupt myself because during a reading someone said, why, had there been a fire? No, people could smoke on airplanes, so that's why everything smelled all the time. My hands smelled like all the food and liquor and Coke I'd spilled. But I didn't even bother to undress. I fell onto the bed and raised my legs, pressing my swollen, sore feet against the wall for relief. How could I have imagined I would actually go sightseeing when I landed? I was in Los Angeles for the first time, but I could have been anywhere. It did not matter. Later, I would soak my feet and the rest of my body in a hot bath. I would eat my room service turkey club sandwich with a glass of Chablis. And I would call my parents, who were giddy with excitement for me. Tell us everything, they said, as soon as they heard my new voice. I was 22 years old, exhausted, and my whole body ached. I had never worked that hard in my life. Like me, my parents had imagined a life of glamour awaiting me. So I told them the only good thing that had happened. I had someone famous on my flight, I said. They were beside themselves. Al Pacino, my father said. No. Elizabeth Taylor, my mother said. No. You know the guy who played the teacher on the TV show Room 222? There was a big pause. Then my mother said, that old TV show. Right, I said, he was on my flight. My father tried to save the day. In first class, I bet. No, he was in coach. How about that, my dad said. So it was great, Mom asked me. So great, I lied, wondering how I was ever going to put my feet back in those high heels and do it all again in the morning. My alarm went off at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I dragged myself out of bed. I had an 8 a.m. flight, which meant I had to be at the airport at 7, which meant I had to leave the hotel at 6:30, which meant I had to be in the restaurant eating breakfast by 6. I showered and put on my uniform that still smelled of stale smoke, put on my makeup, and went downstairs. The lobby and restaurant were empty. The hostess seated me, and I ordered coffee and an omelet. While I was eating, a man came over to my table. I'm a TWA flight attendant too, he said. Are you okay? Yeah, why? Well, you're sitting here in your uniform in the middle of the night, he said. No, I told him, I'm on the 8 o'clock flight. But it's 3 in the morning, he said. I looked at my watch. No, it's 6. On the East Coast, he said gently. It's 3 hours earlier here. I looked away so he wouldn't see me about to cry. It's okay, he said. First flight out here? I nodded. It gets easier, he said. As soon as he was gone, I paid my check and went back to bed. That was my inauspicious beginning. I was saying that it was such a confusing time, the 60s and 70s for girls and for women. But when I was in 6th grade, I read a book. It was called How to Become an Airline Stewardess. And the first line of that book was, would you like a boyfriend in every city in the world? And I'm like, yeah. Definitely. And so we had to go and see our guidance counselor and announce what we wanted to be, this grand meeting we had. And I said, I want to be a writer. And his name was Mr. Stone. He was so of the era, it was like 1970 or something. He had aviator glasses and like the big sideburns. And male teachers had to wear suits every day. He owned exactly one, so he always had this wide brown corduroy suit. It could be like 90 degrees, this guy had this corduroy suit. But he said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to be a writer. And he said, oh, Anne, people don't do that. And I said, well, how do you get all these books then? And he kind of looked over and he said, yeah, all the people who wrote those books are dead. I was like, oh, this is throwing a problem into my plan. So I said, well, then I'd like to be an airline stewardess. And he said, what is wrong with you? Where do you get these ideas? Smart girls don't become airline stewardesses. And I said, well, then what do you suggest? Because those are my 2 ideas. And he said, oh, be a teacher or a secretary, just make your life easy and get married. And after my first novel came out, if I ever did a local reading, he would come, older and older, shuffling, different suit, thank God. He'd come over and he'd like lean down. And I'd say, oh, Mr. Stone, it's so good to see you. And I'd hug him and he'd whisper, don't tell that story. Don't tell that story. And I said, oh, I'm telling that story for the rest of my life because people have to know what young women in 1970 were told, that it was a big thing to push beyond those norms, So years pass, and of course, very quickly, you stop doing those things like forgetting time zones and making all those mistakes. You become very competent and very confident very quickly. So that after, I don't know, a few years, I was able to work any of those airplanes with as much confidence as anything. I didn't, panic. My roommate and I used to buddy bid, which meant we flew together, so we had layovers in London and Rome, and it was so fun, and everything was great. But I continued to try to write a book. I wanted to be a novelist. And one of the reasons, other than the boyfriends in every city in the world, that it appealed to me to be a flight attendant was that, I would get to travel. So I kept writing, and I wrote my first novel, basically on 747s. The passengers would be asleep on international flights, and then I would pull out my notebook, wrote it in longhand, and it was called Somewhere Off the Coast of Maine. And it did sell. I got a publisher, sold to Bantam Books as one of the 2 launch books in their Bantam New Fiction series. I thought I would keep working as a flight attendant because I had no desire to stop flying. I loved my job. I loved TWA, and I imagined years ahead of writing books and being a flight attendant. One day, shortly after I sold my novel, I was working first class to Tucson, Arizona. A man boarded the plane, and he began opening and closing the overhead compartments and banging them shut and popping them open and banging them shut. He pushed all the buttons above him, the lights, the call button, and in general, he acted like someone who had never set foot on an airplane. Really unusual for a passenger flying in first class at that time. After takeoff, I asked him what he would like to drink. "How do I know?" he said. "I don't know what you have here." I listed everything on board, the juices, the sodas, the beers, the wines, the liquor, before he shook his head and waved me away. "Don't bother me," he said. Later, when it was time for dessert, I wheeled out my cart with all the fixings for ice cream sundaes. "Do you want a hot fudge sundae?" I asked him, "or maybe butterscotch?" His face grew red with anger. "What, you think I'm a child? Only children eat ice cream." I couldn't take it any longer. Who was this guy? I had to know. "Why are you going to Tucson?" I asked him. He told me that he was a best-selling writer, and he was going to Tucson to give a talk. "How about that?" I said. "I'm a writer too." "Oh, you are?" he said, amused. I told him about my book sale, and he scrunched up his face and stared at me. "No," he said finally. "You look too dumb to be a writer." Oh, that TWA training kicked in, thankfully. "I think you mean you don't expect a flight attendant to also be a writer," I said. He scratched up his face again and studied me even more. Then he said, "No, you look too dumb to be a writer." A few years later, after my first novel was published, I did a book signing at the ABA, the American Booksellers Association convention, in Washington, D.C. The ABA is a trade association that promotes independent booksellers. And during the convention, thousands of booksellers come to hear writers talk about their books and to get signed galleys. For a first-time novelist, the sight of a line of people waiting for you to sign their galleys is overwhelming and about as exciting as something can be. Seeing a passenger who called you dumb just a few years earlier waiting in that long line is downright thrilling. Finally, it was his turn. He put his elbows on the table. "I bet you don't remember me," he said. "Oh, I will never forget," I told him, with a big smile, channeling my inner flight attendant. People always ask me, about crazy passengers, weird passengers, whatever. And there were so many. Most people were perfectly normal and therefore forgettable. But one of my favorites was on a flight to San Juan, Puerto Rico, from San Juan to New York. And I have my cart, and I look at this guy to ask him what he'd like to drink. And I see that he has on a shirt and a tie and his tidy whities. Now, I know he hadn't boarded that way. And so I said, "Sir, where are your pants?" And he goes, "In the overhead compartment." And I said, "But you have to wear them on the plane." And he said, "No, they'll get wrinkled." Which seemed perfectly reasonable. Now, that 22-year-old, would have, I don't know what I would have done in that situation, but by that time I'd been flying a few years. I just got him a blanket. I said, "Okay, cover up, but make sure when you exit you have your pants on," and I saw him and he did. So you never knew what was going to happen. Anything could happen. So I don't know what time it is. How are we doing, Shane? I've not been paying attention.
We still got plenty of time.
Okay. I did want to read one more section, which is people often ask me, like, what's the worst flight you were on and what's the best flight you were on? And the worst, there's many different ways to interpret that, but I did, when I was based in St. Louis, have a passenger die on a flight. And that was definitely the worst thing that I had to do. I never had like an emergency landing or anything like that. But I had to do CPR, even though we knew he had died. But we didn't have the ability or the authority to pronounce them dead. So we were flying from Pittsburgh to St. Louis and had to land somewhere I can't remember and keep doing CPR until he was taken, off the plane. And it was terrible. And I remember when he came on, he had a fedora on, which is funny because it was like 1980 something. Men weren't really wearing hats like that anymore. But I commented on his little feather. But I also noticed it because he looked like my dad. He just reminded me of my dad. And he had that heart attack on takeoff. And so it was terrible. We finally get back to St. Louis and we're leaving the plane. And there's a guy standing at the gate back in the days when you went right to the gate to pick people up, And he's like, is everybody off? And I said, yeah. He said, oh, because I was supposed to pick up, Mr. Whatever. And I knew that was the guy. And they didn't know each other, so it wasn't a big emotional thing. They worked, he was picking up for work. But I just remember standing there and the lovely gate agent coming over and saying, I'll handle this, you go. So he was then told the terrible news. But I'd like to share one of the best things that happened. I have to say that maybe the second worst or vying for the worst was on a 747 when the pilot asked me for 2 Jack Daniels. So that was pretty bad. It was scary. Of course, I said no. I did this thing like we were told how to deflect things by going, don't be, that's ridiculous. Don't be silly, like making light of it. And the guy looked at me right in the eye. I said, get me 2 Jack Daniels on the rocks. So I went back out, I got the coffees for the other people in the cockpit, and I said, you sure you don't want anything? He said, I told you what I want. So I'm like, sorry, I can't do that. And I'm shaking, and I used the analogy of, in those days, nurses to doctors, like you wouldn't quite, I know the times have changed, but you wouldn't question a doctor, even if you knew maybe he wasn't handling something the best way. It was kind of that way. And I remember thinking, I can't even report this guy, because when he was doing this, the first officer and flight engineer looked away, like they didn't look at me or like they were letting it happen, right? So I'm setting up the first class service and I see him come out, he goes into the liquor, he gets 2 Jack Daniels and a glass of ice and goes back in the cockpit. So that landing was one of my scariest because I don't know how many times he visited the liquor cart, right? I was busy working. But my best was also in the cockpit. Never has the magic of flying been more obvious to me than on a long ago December flight right before Christmas of 1985. The captain of the 747 I was working from Rome invited me to sit in the cockpit for landing. He told me I had to be absolutely quiet the whole time. I strapped into the extra jump seat, already enjoying the view out of the large cockpit windows. The pilots spoke to air traffic controllers. Things beeped. The 450 tons of metal and glass began to descend into the winter evening. As we descended, snow started to fall, small bright flakes like fairy dust. Then Manhattan came into sight, its snowy illuminated skyline rising majestically before us. The air grew tense, electric with voices and the crackles of the radio. The ground seemed to lift up to greet us, that glittery snow falling heavier now, the lights of the runway and the jet brighter, and the wheels hit the ground and the magic ended. We were back on Earth. Overcome, my eyes teared up. It's something, isn't it? The captain said softly. I could only nod. Few times in my life have I experienced something that felt that majestic, that reminded me that all of us are alive. The lava from a volcano crashing red and fiery into the Pacific Ocean in Hawaii, standing beneath the Great Pyramid at Giza, the feel of a baby sliding out of me, 2 babies, Sam and Grace, than unbelievably holding my daughter dead suddenly at only 5 years old from a virulent form of strep. And then 3 years later, in a sterile city hall in China, holding my daughter Annabelle, an 11-month-old baby girl we traveled halfway around the world for. And that snowy landing, when I understood as much as we can, how sky and earth and snow and light and man coexist. So I can tell stories forever, but I'd love to answer questions. Wanted to give you a taste of what the book said. Like, can we get questions from the online people too, Shane?
Yes.
Okay,
They
great.
haven't typed any up yet, but virtual audience, if you want to type up your questions now, we can get to those.
Yeah.
I might have the number wrong.
Okay.
Who is 47F?
So you do have it right.
Oh, do I?
Yeah,
Okay,
47F. So it was so funny because my roommates, and I lived with the same people, for years. They always met guys on flights. They always had dates, and I never, ever got asked out. I was like, what am I doing wrong here? I thought I had a boyfriend in every city in the world. That's what I signed up for. Or if I did have dates, they were just big disasters. But they would be trotting happily, like my one roommate. He was like, oh, I just went on a date with Timothy Hutton. Do you remember the actor? And he's the best kisser I ever had. And I'm like, well, I just had a date with this dud guy who, I couldn't get away from. So it was that always. I was on a flight from San Francisco to New York, and I see a guy get on, and it sounds like I was guy crazy, and I really wasn't. It wasn't all about guys, but it was, fun on the job. So you have to distract yourself. So anyway, he comes on, I think that guy's kind of adorable. He's sitting in 47F, and we're talking back and forth a little shyly, and I remember the San Francisco Chronicle at the time, the arts section on Sundays was pink. So I started reading this pink paper, so I'm like, ooh, he's reading the arts section, that's good, I like that. So I'm doing the service, and I actually have a funny PS to this story, and it was, as I say in the book, a choice of lasagna or short ribs. And people always want the pasta, right? So I get to the guy sort of diagonally across from 47F, so he's like in 45C or something. And I say, and we've run out of the lasagna. And I say, oh, here's your short ribs. And he goes, I don't want short ribs. And I said, oh, we're out of lasagna. The short ribs are great. He said, no, I don't want short ribs. And I said, no, we're going to get more, here's your short ribs. And he says, that's because you've given the pasta to all your friends on this airplane. And I said, sir, I don't know anybody on this airplane. I'm trying to know this guy, but I don't know him. And I said, no, I swear we're just handing them out. I'm really sorry, you're in the back. And he says, you get me some lasagna. And I said, there's no place to get it. And he freaks out. And he starts banging the overhead. He breaks the light. The compartment flies open, stuff flies out, and he's red-faced, he's kind of getting up. So another flight attendant sees it. She runs and gets the pilot. We have to restrain him, with his stuff to restrain passengers, PS hidden up there in those overhead. We restrain him. He's like, I'm going to get that blonde one. I'm going to get her. She gave all her friends the lasagna. I'm going to get her. So they had to move him out of my section. And then they tell me, when we land, the police are going to meet the flight, and you have to go with the police and file a report on, what happened. Now, by this time, 47F is like, that's the craziest thing I've ever seen. And we start talking, and I can tell he's going to ask me out. I can just tell, right? But now I have to go meet the police. So I take a cocktail napkin, and I write, bet you'll never forget this flight. Oh, dear 47F, I bet you'll never forget this flight. I go to the police station, have a nice night, and then I sign my name and my phone number. And then I go, and I'm waiting for the police, I'm talking to them, and I see him leaving, so I go running down the jetway, and I give him the cocktail napkin, and he kind of smiles. Took me so long to do all the police business, so I get back to my apartment, and in those days, answering machines, I told you how many calls had come, and I had one call, and I played it, it's like, this is 47F. And we went out for 5 years.
Oh.
Yeah. So, and we're still friends. And so around his birthday or my birthday, we usually email or text each other or whatever. And so he texted me and said, oh, we can't have lunch if our birthdays were very close for our birthdays this year because I moved to Hawaii. And I said, oh, that's so, wow, lucky you. And then I said, I was just telling someone about the guy and the lasagna, and he says, Annie, it was manicotti. And he was right. It wasn't lasagna, it was manicotti. Yeah. Okay, what else? That's a long-winded answer about 47F. Yes.
Was there, on the planes you worked on over the years, was there a row 13?
No row 13 on TWA. Some airlines did have it, but we didn't. It's like some elevators don't have the 13th floor. You know, we did have a interesting thing in training. So we flew Lockheed 1011s, other airlines flew DC-10s, very comparable airplanes. But Eastern and TWA flew Lockheed 1011s. Eastern had a really famous crash in the 60s in the Everglades on Christmas Eve in a Lockheed 1011. And the plane was destroyed, but they used the parts on other Lockheed 1011s. And some of those parts were on TWA planes. And people used to report seeing the flight engineer saying, I'm just gonna go down and check. So we were told, if you see a guy in Eastern Airlines uniform on the flight, don't be scared, he's benevolent. And I was like, wait, you're talking about ghosts. In training. Yeah. Wild, right? What else?
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
I'm kind of an airplane enthusiast.
I can tell.
Was there a type of plane over the years that you enjoyed working on versus a type of plane that you just thought, oh my God?
Oh, I did not like those 707s, which, I mean, in 1978, they were obsolete. They were getting, phased out. So this was the first jumbo jet. And they used to be used to go to Europe, and you had to stop and refuel in either Gander or Shannon. They had the engines on the wings, and they were so noisy. Like, you could not hear yourself think on those planes. And they had, I don't know, 200 people or something. There was a single aisle. So you'd get on that plane, and it was just like, I have to feed all these people. You just could see all the way down. Noisy. So I didn't love those, but I loved Lockheed 1011s. That was my favorite. They were so beautiful. They were so quiet. Maybe that's my thing. I need to be quiet. And they had this funny feature, which was there was an elevator. And all of the food and everything was stored below. And so one flight attendant worked below and sent up the food and sent up the carts in this little elevator. We called it the lift. And if you had a bad day or had a hangover or just had a fight with your spouse or something, you'd say, I'd like to work G. And they'd say, go down there. But you'd have to deal with passengers. That was kind of a funny thing when you'd be down there. And you'd hear dogs barking, people who were sending their dogs, with them. And that used to be weird, because it's like, those dogs aren't happy, I used to think. Yeah. I love 747s too, but I will say that I never felt quite as comfortable as they were just so big. They were so beautiful. And I loved that spiral staircase. And it was like a lounge up there. It was like a bar for first class. And so it was kind of fun to work up there. But the downside of it was that the tail cone section, which was called E-zone, only one flight attendant worked at, there were like 30 seats or something, but it was the smoking section. And so you just were like gasping for air if you worked back there. Yeah, Shane.
On your touring as an author, do you reveal that you have had a long career? Do you try to hide that? Have you ever had moments where you're like, I know exactly what you're going through? I'm always proud of my years as a flight attendant because I honestly believe this. I said earlier, it was a coming of age story, but everything I am is because of that job. Well, not things like that my parents instilled in me, but being comfortable, being able to go anywhere in the world and feel comfortable, making people feel comfortable. Feeling at home in the world, getting poised, So I'm always very proud of it. If it comes up, I definitely talk about it. I had a funny thing. It was at a library on Cape Cod, and a former flight attendant came in her uniform. I cracked up. I thought, that's a flight attendant. They're a funny bunch. They have a funny job, and they, And I said, I cannot believe you wore your uniform to this reading. And I said, I also can't believe, you still fit in it. And she goes, oh, I don't. And she lifted her shirt, the zipper was broken, the jacket, she had ripped it by putting her arms in it, but she had that thing on, the scarf tied, her lipstick, it was so great. We had to wear a certain color lipstick that had to match the stripe in our jacket, sleeve jacket. So this particular color, like magenta. I know, yes.
The first time I flew was probably back in the late 60s.
Yep.
And it was TWA, and I specifically remembered you dressed up to fly.
Oh, yeah.
That was your Sunday go to meeting clothes.
That's right.
But I remember the flight attendants, and I found out later that every attendant was custom fitted for her uniform.
Yep.
And it was best quality everything.
Yep.
And they looked it. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
they could have gone on a runway.
Oh, yeah.
So it was years again before I flew,
Mm-hmm.
and that had been on TWA.
Mm-hmm.
The next time I flew was Southwest, and here are these attendants wearing their slouchy knit sweaters, their knee shorts, their socks, and
Yeah,
their
yeah.
tennis shoes, and it's like, when did this happen?
I know. I know. So it was a very big thing starting in the 50s for top designers to design flight attendant uniforms. And they were custom made. You were fit for your uniform. You know, the hem, the everything was just yours alone. So if I couldn't find my jacket, I couldn't wear my roommate's. You know, you had your own stuff. And we had Ralph Lauren. Braniff at the time had Halston designed uniforms. Pan Am had Valentino at one point. I mean, they were beautiful and they were very good quality. Yeah, they were really nice.
But yeah, when did it start that they just ditched all that and went to this?
Yeah, you know, I really blame almost everything that we suffer these days, including those uniforms, on deregulation, which, you know, it's not the most interesting topic. I worked really hard in the book to explain it simply because you could write a book just on that if somebody loved laws and things like that. But basically, before deregulation, which started in 1978, the year I was hired, the government set all the prices for flights. And that's why it was so rarefied. So to go from LA to Boston, for example, was about $1,700 in today's dollars. And that's why a lot of people didn't fly. And it was Ted Kennedy, actually, who spearheaded the law and got it passed to take away what was called the CAB. And they were the ones who ran everything, and to say, no, deregulation. Airlines can bid on stuff, they can do whatever they want. It became like the Wild West of flying. I don't know if any of you knew like People's Express, New York Air. There were so many small airlines where you could go for $29 to faraway places. That all was from deregulation. But what happened is the big airlines couldn't compete, and that's why so many of them are gone now. So many of those wonderful airlines. And those airlines were kind of flashes in the pan. They also went under, and that's why we have so few airlines left. Really, we have like the big three or something. Yeah. But things like that changed. I read a funny thing in some Newsweek article or something where a pilot said, flying went to hell the day American Airlines stopped serving olives in their martinis. And, you know, he was being cheeky, but what it meant was they just started cutting back everything. Right? Yeah. I'll tell you, walking around those high heels, I'm a little jealous of them and their tennis shoes. Yeah.
I love the book. You hit it on the nail for me that it's a coming of age story. I mean, I love the history of the industry, its beginnings, its deregulation. And I'm curious, you had the chutzpah to pursue those two dreams, to be a flight attendant, stewardess when you started, and then to write. I get the sense your parents played a big role in your guidance counselor, they were supportive. But like, what advice would you give the young women today about pursuing one's dreams?
Yeah.
Because I think it's still.
Oh, it's still, I know.
story for young women.
I agree with you. Yeah. Women still, they're still out there fighting for everything. I had fabulous parents. And they always said, you can do anything you want if you put your mind to it. You know, you can achieve anything. And they always supported me. My mother was a little more of a nervous Nelly. Like, she was always worried. So she used to always say to me, they're hiring at the post office. And you would work in air conditioning and you'd have a pension and, you know, and I'd be like, I don't wanna work in the post office. I want to be a flight attendant and a writer, and I had those two things forever. But once she knew she got free tickets, she was good with it, you know, she became very happy. And also because they saw me, I mean, I was like writing, I put that in air quotes, from the time I was like 7 or 8. And just they saw how much I read and how dedicated I was to writing. You know, I just wrote all the time. I read them my stories. So they knew I had this passion. But I know it sounds so corny, but you know, just women and you know, your daughters and your sons just follow your heart. Like it always makes me a little, and if you did this or believe in this, I'm not, you know, trying to dispute it. But for me, I always feel sad when I hear a young person say, well, I have to have a safe job, so I'm gonna go into fill in the blank and not pursue something that is harder to do. I mean, going into the arts is harder, right? Are you in the arts? You're not, and yeah. My son is in theater, he's an actor, and he came home from a party in high school, like a graduation party. He said, you know, Mr. whatever the guy's name is, said the weirdest thing to me. And I said, what is it? He said, your mother's gonna let you major in theater? And he said, why wouldn't you? And that was the first he had heard of someone not supporting a kid's dream. You know, so, you know, I've got artsy kids and they're gonna be poor, they're not gonna be supporting me, but yeah. Yeah, I just believe in them. People make it, they do it. What else? Anything else before I sign books? Yeah,
Another,
yeah,
you said even after 8 years, you were still kind of at the bottom.
yeah.
And a classmate of mine, she hired on with Southwest.
Mhm.
She was with them for 30 years, and by the time she retired, she was in management. But I'm wondering, from what you said, how long would it take her then to get into management if after 8 years, you were still kind of.
Well, you know, every airline's different, and of course, TWA was, you know, old school, but no one I knew wanted to go into management. Those were people with business degrees or whatever. You know, every flight attendant I knew wanted to be a flight attendant. Like I got asked a question the other day. I was like, how many flight attendants wanted to be pilots? I was like, none. And, you know, that just was a different job. You know what I mean? TWA was famously broke all the time and mismanaged. That was one of the things we were known for. Like when I was doing my research, like I came across a Kansas City newscaster saying, they're perpetually going out of business, TWA, and that was like in the 60s, you know? So they were always mismanaged, and as a result, they didn't hire enough people, they hired too many people, and that's why they didn't hire a lot of people under me. And so that's why I was so junior for so long. It was just it was just numbers.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I'll just say, it was a thrilling read.
Oh,
I
thank you.
never thought about the life of a young woman becoming a flight attendant, and I thought you just described it and took us there so well. And I really enjoyed learning about that type of life and profession. And it, you know, it kind of made me say, oh gosh, you know, if I were my age, I would go do that.
Oh, that's so
yeah.
great. Someone told me a couple of days ago, after I read your book, I'm so nice to flight attendants now. I had no idea. I was like, my job is done. You know, if you now appreciate them more, knowing what it's like, good for you. Yeah, thank you for saying that though. That's really nice. And thank you everybody for being here. I know there's like crazy weather coming, so thank you for braving it out here.
Thank you.
All right, let's have another giant round of applause. All right, so Ann will sign up here, and we do have copies of the book available for sale at the desk if you have not already gotten a copy, including the novels and other memoir, children's books as well. So, yeah, thank you all so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What's your name? Sue.
Thank you for picking my books. That's so nice.
Do you mind if I take